Welcome to the deep dive.
It's great to be here.
Today we're really plunging into some interesting material. One of you sent us a transcription of a lecture, and it explores this concept called spiritual state.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. And our mission, really, is to unpack what this spiritual state idea means,
Mm.
at least according to this source material,
Right, how it connects to, who we are as humans.
and why the source seems to think understanding it is just fundamentally important, crucial even.
We've definitely got a lot to cover. We'll look at how this lecture describes us spirit, soul, body, and particularly the brain.
And then how these parts are supposedly influenced,
Yeah.
right, by spiritual forces, worldly ideas.
Exactly. And the really interesting part, what are the practical implications? For real life, the text gives some very specific, quite intense examples.
It does. Okay, let's dive in.
So right off the bat, this material introduces spiritual state, and it makes a specific point, doesn't it? That this is different from just having spiritual problems.
That's a key distinction they make early on. The core idea is that humans are spiritual beings,
Yeah.
created that way.
Okay.
So it just follows that everyone has a spiritual state. It's inherent. And this state, according to the source, it kind of operates in one of two main modes.
Two modes, and they sound pretty distinct. One is about being open to negative forces.
Yeah, vulnerable. They use words like darkness, emptiness, chaos to describe that state.
And the other.
The other is characterized by what the source calls the life of Christ. And that leads to, positive spiritual impact and activity. The argument is your state leans heavily one way or the other.
Okay, so if we all have this spiritual state, how does the source describe us? What are the components they're looking at?
They break us down into three main parts: spirit, soul, and body-brain.
Spirit, soul, body, brain. Let's take the spirit first. What's that, according to this lecture?
The spirit, they say, is the part actually created in God's image. That's what makes us spiritual beings fundamentally different.
So it's not like ghosts or general energy?
Exactly. They're quite specific. It's not the common worldly idea of spirit.
Mm-hmm.
This is distinct from God.
Got it. Okay. And the soul, what's contained there?
The soul is presented as the seat of our emotion and our reason.
Emotion and reason.
Yeah, and sort of under that umbrella of soul, they list things like the mind, thought, consciousness, even the subconscious and unconscious.
Wow. Okay. So basically our whole inner mental and emotional landscape.
Pretty much.
And then the body, our physical selves. But you mentioned the brain specifically. The source emphasizes that.
Oh, absolutely. The brain gets special attention. It's described as the control tower.
Control tower.
Yeah, the central hub connecting the spirit and the body. This is really crucial. The brain is where these things called imprints are stored.
Imprints in the brain. That sounds important.
It seems foundational to their whole argument.
Okay, so we've got spirit, soul, body, brain, and these imprints. How do they say these parts get influenced?
Well, they argue there's this constant influence happening from both negative spiritual forces and, interestingly, worldly concepts.
So spiritual forces first. How does that work?
They describe Satan as primarily holding or influencing the overall spiritual state, sort of targeting the spirit itself.
Okay. And what about demons? Where do they fit in?
Demons, according to the source, focus more on the soul, specifically the mind and thought.
Ah, the mind and thoughts.
Yeah, and they often use past hurts. The source uses the term wounds as a way in, affecting how we think and feel.
Using vulnerabilities.
Mhm.
Okay. And what about the non-spiritual influences? Worldly concepts.
Right. Those are said to influence the soul's reason and consciousness. This is where our convictions and beliefs come into play.
Convictions and beliefs, like philosophies
Yeah.
or religious ideas.
Exactly. Rooted in religion, philosophy, that sort of thing. And the source has a really strong take on the common ideas of good and evil.
How so?
Well, they see our everyday standards of good and evil, morality, ethics, law, when separated from the context of God, as something introduced by Satan back in Genesis 3.
Wow, okay.
And they're quite critical of people who mix these worldly standards with their faith.
Is that where the conviction plus Christ idea comes in? Or wounds plus Christ?
That's precisely it. The argument is that if your foundation is partly built on these worldly ideas of good evil, or shaped by past wounds, instead of purely on the truth they're presenting, well, that mix actually stops real spiritual change.
It prevents it.
That's what they suggest. It keeps the fundamental state from shifting. And all this time, The brain is getting these imprints.
Right, the imprints again.
Yes. And the source argues that because humans are born separated from God, the initial imprints are inherently negative. They literally call it a Satan's watchtower already built in our brain.
Satan's watchtower, that's quite an image. Okay, this is where it starts to get really practical, isn't it?
Absolutely. Because the core argument is that this whole picture, your spiritual state, the influences on your spirit and soul, these negative imprints in your brain, it fundamentally dictates your reality, your outcomes.
So it's not just about knowing the right things or doing religious stuff.
Not at all, according to this lecture.
Yeah.
It's not about intellectual knowledge or activity alone. They talk about needing a fundamental spiritual understanding, a deep realization, which they say God has to enable.
And this explains why people get stuck, even after years of practice.
That's the explanation offered. Why people hit boundaries, feel like they aren't changing. The source says it's not that they're stuck, maybe they just haven't started properly, because that underlying spiritual state hasn't actually changed.
And they give examples.
Oh yeah, very specific, quite challenging examples. There's one about someone really wrapped up in national politics, worrying about votes.
Okay.
While, according to the source, being completely blind to a major spiritual issue happening with their own child, who's described as disabled and struggling spiritually.
So the focus is on the worldly instead of the immediate spiritual reality.
That's the critique, yeah.
Yeah.
The source asks rhetorically, are you worrying about the country? Will changing politics solve your life's problems? Implying the focus is misplaced. There's a really tragic story about a suicide in a family.
Oh, wow.
And the source describes how afterwards the family got caught up in arguments, legal fights over property and apartment.
Over property after a suicide?
Yeah. And the point the lecture makes is that they became so consumed by these worldly disputes, the fight over assets, that they completely missed the critical window to share their faith or address the spiritual crisis with the relative who was suffering. It's presented as profound spiritual blindness.
That's heavy.
It is.
Yeah.
They also talk about why people might leave a faith community.
Why is that, according to them?
It often comes down to personal convictions clashing with things in the community. But the source argues these convictions are often based on those worldly ideas of good and evil we talked about.
So the conviction plus Christ people.
Exactly. Or wounds plus Christ. When their worldly-based conviction gets challenged, they ultimately choose the conviction over the faith, the argument.
I see. And there was an example about illness, too. Cancer.
Yes. Someone with cancer getting good medical treatment, but not improving physically.
Okay.
And this person apparently has a realization, not about getting healed physically, but that simply being saved, having that connection to God that is the real witness, regardless of the illness's outcome.
A shift in perspective.
A fundamental shift in spiritual understanding, even amidst suffering. That's how it's framed.
Okay, so if the problem is this negative spiritual state and these deep brain imprints, what's the solution offered? How do you change it?
The path forward, according to this material, is all about changing those imprints actively. They call it gospel editing.
Gospel editing.
Yeah. And they stress it's not just about effort or willpower. It requires that spiritual understanding we mentioned, enabled by God's work.
Are there specific methods they recommend for this?
Editing. They do suggest some practical things, like transcribing messages, writing them out word for word as you listen.
Writing them out.
Yeah, and memorization. Meditation on the messages, and using all 5 senses is emphasized. Hearing, seeing.
And writing by hand. You mentioned that earlier.
Yes, they specifically highlight writing by hand over typing. They argue it's much better for imprinting things onto the brain.
That's really specific.
It is. And they use a pretty dramatic story to back this up. Someone in a vegetative state.
Right, you mentioned that.
Messages were played into their ear for years, apparently. And they woke up. The source presents this as proof. The brain revived. So the spirit revived, connecting brain function directly to spiritual life.
So the brain is absolutely central to this whole process of change.
Totally central.
Yeah.
And they contrast this with how the world might approach the brain science, trying to empty the brain for learning, or things like brain-computer interfaces. Elon Musk's projects are mentioned.
How do they see that?
Well, they acknowledge the world sees the brain's importance, but maybe misses the spiritual dimension. There's even a warning that technology like brain chips could potentially be used for negative control, turning people into robots is the word used.
Wow. So, okay, let me see if I'm getting this. The real struggle, according to this source, isn't just outward things, but it's against these internal negative Satan's watchtower imprints already in our brains.
That seems to be the absolute core message. Changing those imprints, doing that gospel editing, rewriting what's on the brain that's presented as the essential first step, the starting point for actually seeing God's work happen and experiencing real change.
Well, this deep dive into spiritual state from these sources, it certainly leaves you with a lot to think about.
It really does. It's a compelling case, maybe a challenging one for some, that our internal state, these deep imprints, shaped by forces maybe we're not even aware of, that this is what's really driving our external reality.
Yeah, and the path to change isn't just, trying harder, knowing more facts, or even just being more religious in our activities.
Exactly. It points to this much deeper level, the spiritual state itself, the imprints physically in our brains as the main arena. And the transformation requires this fundamental shift, started by intentionally putting the gospel into our minds and brains, using, well, every sense and method available.
So, for you listening, thinking about your own life, how might this idea of imprints or a spiritual state needing change offer a different perspective, a different way to look at challenges or maybe limitations you feel you face?
Yeah, and what might it actually look like practically to engage with this idea of gospel editing in the way these sources describe? Something to definitely consider.